So picture this. It's the 1770s, right? And the American colonies are, well, they're basically teetering right on the absolute edge of an all-out catastrophic war.
Oh, yeah. Totally on the brink.
Right. But if you were to, ask the British Crown where the most dangerous, subversive threat to their entire global empire was coming from, they wouldn't point to the battlefields.
No, they wouldn't.
They wouldn't point to the Minutemen drilling on the village greens or the merchants hoarding tea and gunpowder. They would point directly to the pulpits.
Which is just a stunning historical reality that, frankly, we often completely overlook today. I mean,
Yeah.
when we look back at the American Revolution, we are so trained to view it through this purely political or economic lens.
Right, like the Stamp Act.
Exactly. The Stamp Act, the Townsend Acts, taxation without representation.
Mm-hmm.
But the actual ideological engine, like the real burning spiritual fire that mobilized everyday ordinary colonists to risk being hanged for treason, that was being stoked every single Sunday morning in these colonial meeting houses.
Wow. And I mean, that is exactly what we are going to explore today in this deep dive. We are stepping back into those 18th century wooden meeting houses to uncover how the spiritual fires of the Great Awakening, that massive continent-shaking religious revival of the 1730s and 40s, how that violently collided with the political upheavals of the 1760s through the 1780s.
Quite a collision, yeah.
It really is. And we have an incredible stack of primary sources to guide us today. We're looking at original writings from John Witherspoon, Isaac Backus, Lemuel Haynes, and James Madison. And our goal here isn't just to recite a timeline of names and dates for you.
Right, we're not doing a textbook lecture.
Exactly. We want to evaluate the profoundly complex relationship between Christian theology, political revolution, and how the reality of true religious liberty was actually forged in the fire of all this.
And as we unpack these sources, we are going to look at them through a very specific theological framework.
Mm-hmm.
Two ministry leaders just grabbing coffee and talking church history.
Yeah.
Because we want to see how this history profoundly impacts your daily walk today. First, we want to look at understanding the Bible more profoundly. Guarding biblical truth so we don't end up just, blending it with whatever the current cultural trend is.
Which is so critical, because when you see God's absolute sovereignty actively working through the incredible chaos, and I mean chaos of the 18th century, it really deepens your personal faith. It builds a massive amount of resilience for us today.
It totally does. And third, we want to inspire a love for Christ. When you see the gospel's power enduring and, frankly, just shining through the deep flaws and contradictions of human history, you just have to marvel at Jesus.
You really do.
His grace and his faithfulness are so evident. And that leads to our fourth pillar, which is daily discipleship and practical ministry. We want to find actionable ways that you, whether you're a first-year seminary student, a local pastor, or just an everyday church member, can apply these historical lessons to your witness in the culture right now.
Okay, let's unpack this, because we need to start with the macro-level political conflict with Great Britain. If we really want to understand how the colonists justified what was, by all accounts, a massive rebellion against their sovereign king, we have to look at this group.
The Black-Robed Regiment.
Yeah. The British officials dismissively, and honestly somewhat fearfully, called them the Black-Robed Regiment.
It is such a fascinating, evocative term. And, it was coined by the British, actually. It referred to the dissenting clergy, the Presbyterians, the Congregationalists, the Baptists.
So not the Anglicans.
Right, exactly. And the British authorities recognized that it was these ministers wearing their traditional black Geneva preaching robes who were giving moral and theological legitimacy to the revolution. They weren't framing the resistance as some secular political revolt. They were framing it through this deep, rich lens of covenant theology.
And at the absolute intellectual center of that movement is a man named John Witherspoon. Before we look at his actual writing, give us a sense of who this guy was, because, looking at his resume, it's kind of mind-blowing.
Oh, he is a towering historical figure.
Right.
And yet, so few people know his name today. John Witherspoon lived from 1723 to 1794. He was born in Scotland and was already this highly respected Presbyterian minister when he was recruited to come across the Atlantic.
Right.
He was brought over to become the president of the College of New Jersey, which, of course, we know today as Princeton University.
Right. And he didn't just run a college. He fundamentally shaped the minds of the men who would write the foundational documents of the United States.
He absolutely did. He synthesized traditional Reformed Calvinist theology with elements of Scottish Enlightenment philosophy. He trained an entire generation of future statesmen, including James Madison, who we'll be talking about at length later on.
Can't wait for that part.
Yeah. And Witherspoon taught them that Christian virtue, grounded in a biblical worldview, was absolutely essential if a republic was going to survive. But perhaps the most incredible piece of trivia about him, he was the only active clergyman to sign the Declaration of Independence.
Wow. Only one. Which brings us to our first primary source. And the setting here is so incredibly tense. The date is May 17th, 1776. The Continental Congress has declared a general day of fasting, humiliation, and prayer across the colonies.
The stakes are just incredibly high.
Yeah. We are less than 2 months away from the Declaration of Independence. The colonies are essentially already at war. People are terrified. And Witherspoon steps into the pulpit at Princeton and preaches a sermon titled The Dominion of Providence Over the Passions of Men.
You really have to put yourself in that pew. Like, try to imagine it. The atmosphere in that room would have been electric with anxiety. British fleets are mobilizing. You have families wondering their sons are going to die in some muddy field, wondering if their towns are going to be burned to the ground.
Just total existential dread.
Exactly. And Witherspoon anchors this entire monumental sermon on an incredibly deep exegesis of Psalm 76, verse 10.
Right. And using the King James Version, which was, standard for him, the verse reads, "Surely the wrath of man shall praise thee. The remainder of wrath shalt thou restrain." Now, just hearing that verse on its face, it sounds very mysterious.
It does.
The wrath of man shall praise thee. Like, what is he actually doing with that text in the middle of a political crisis?
It's a brilliant theological move. Witherspoon breaks this verse down into a dual motion of God's providence. He wants his congregation to understand exactly how God operates in the middle of human chaos. So the first half of that motion is what theologians call positive permissive overruling.
Okay, let's unpack that. Positive permissive overruling. What does that actually look like in practice? Like, how does God do that?
So the verse says, "The wrath of man shall praise thee." Witherspoon is explaining that God permits human sin, wickedness, and aggressive hostility. In their specific context, he's talking about what the colonists viewed as the tyranny, the malice, and the oppressive wrath of the British Parliament and King George III. Witherspoon is saying God is permitting this crisis, but he permits it only to the exact degree that it will ultimately manifest his own glory, his own justice, and his sovereign power.
So he's using it.
Exactly. God takes the evil, malicious intentions of men and instrumentally uses them to bring about a righteous outcome that the evil actors, well, they never intended it.
I have to say, when I was reading this part of the source material, I couldn't help but think of it like watching a master chess player.
Oh, that's a good way to look at it.
Right. Because God's providence here isn't him forcing the opponent to make illegal moves. He's not the author of sin. He doesn't inject malice into King George's heart, but God is so sovereign, such a grand master of the board, that he uses the opponent's most aggressive, malicious attacks to perfectly set up his own winning endgame.
I love that.
Yeah. The opponent is acting freely in their hostility, but God is orchestrating the ultimate outcome to win the game.
That is an excellent way to conceptualize it.
Mm-hmm.
And Witherspoon was incredibly careful to maintain that biblical balance because you have divine sovereignty working alongside human moral responsibility.
Mm-hmm.
The human actors, the corrupt ministers in London, the soldiers committing abuses, they remain completely morally guilty for their malicious motives.
Right. They are off the hook.
Not at all. They are completely accountable for their sin. But God, in his providence, overrules those motives so that the ultimate result is the advancement of liberty, justice, and the gospel.
Okay, so that's the positive permissive overruling. What about the second half of the verse? The remainder of wrath shalt thou restrain.
Ah, right. That is the negative restraining sovereign limit.
Sounds intense.
It is. Witherspoon says that human malice is not autonomous. It is not some free agent that can just do whatever it wants in the universe. God sets an absolute unbreakable boundary on evil. Yeah. The wrath of man can only go exactly as far as God allows it to go for his ultimate purposes.
Yeah.
Once it hits that invisible line, God restrains it, not 1 inch further. So Witherspoon is looking at a terrified congregation and basically saying the British Army is not ultimately in control. God is.
Which is incredibly comforting. But here is the thing that completely stopped me in my tracks when I was reading the sermon. I kept looking at the date, May 1776. I'm thinking about the title, The Continental Congress Fast Day, The Looming War. I'm expecting a fiery political rally from the very first
And they
sentence.
are a call to arms.
Yeah, but Witherspoon spends the entire first half of the sermon talking almost exclusively about spiritual salvation. He doesn't even mention King George III for pages. He's talking about the soul. Why does he flip the script like that? If I'm sitting in that pew, knowing the redcoats might be marching down the road in a month, I want to hear about how we're going to defeat the tyrant. Why is he talking about my personal sin?
What's fascinating here is that for Witherspoon, the eternal threat of spiritual death is infinitely more terrifying than the temporal threat of a British musket.
Wow.
Yeah. And this is where we see a profound lesson in guarding biblical truth and prioritizing the gospel. Witherspoon leans heavily into the Reformed doctrine of total depravity. He essentially looks out at this congregation of zealous patriots and says, the ultimate enemy is not the British Empire. The ultimate enemy is the corruption of your own heart.
He essentially argues that political freedom, as great as it is completely useless to a person who is eternally enslaved to their own sin.
Yes. He explicitly calls his hearers to personal repentance, to justification by faith alone, and to reconciliation with God through the blood of Jesus Christ. And he does this long before he gives them any theological justification for picking up a weapon.
That is so pastoral.
It really is. He is pastoral, but he's incredibly firm. He warns them against the idolatry of confusing political zeal with personal holiness.
It is such a stark warning because he's telling them you can be the bravest soldier in the Continental Army. You can bleed and die for a completely just, righteous political cause, and you can still perish eternally if your heart is unregenerate. Like you can save your country and lose your soul.
And that framework is so critical for believers navigating any kind of cultural or political turbulence today. I mean, Witherspoon was deeply actively involved in politics. Again, the man signed the Declaration of Independence. He was a delegate to Congress.
Right.
But he absolutely refused to let the political crisis eclipse the primary mission of the church, which is the proclamation of the gospel of Jesus Christ.
But I'm stuck on something here, and I imagine a lot of colonists were stuck on this too. If Witherspoon is this devout minister and he is preaching from the Bible, how on earth is he justifying a violent revolution against the established government?
The Romans 13 problem.
Exactly. Doesn't the Apostle Paul explicitly say in Romans chapter 13, let every person be subject to the governing authorities? How did he and the other patriot pastors reconcile that? Because weren't their pastors telling them that rebellion was a sin?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
There was a fierce, bitter theological debate happening. Loyalist Anglican priests, like Samuel Seabury, were publishing pamphlets all across the colonies saying exactly that. They were quoting Romans 13 and arguing that armed rebellion was a direct, damnable violation of Scripture.
Wow.
They argued that the king was appointed by God, and to resist the king was to literally resist God himself.
So how did Witherspoon counter that without just, ignoring Paul's words?
He didn't ignore them at all.
Yeah.
He relied on a deep well of what is called Reformed resistance theory, which goes all the way back to theologians like John Calvin and John Knox in the 1500s. The Patriot pastors didn't ignore Romans 13. They exegeted it very carefully.
Okay, so they dug into the text.
Right. They argue that Paul is not commanding blind, unconditional submission to any tyrant, regardless of what that tyrant does. They pointed out that in Romans 13, Paul defines what the governing authority is actually supposed to be. Paul says rulers are to be ministers of God for good and a terror to bad conduct.
Okay, so the authority has a specific God-ordained job description.
Precisely. The authority is instituted by God to uphold justice, protect the innocent, and punish evil. Witherspoon argued that subjection and obedience apply when rulers are actually fulfilling that mandate.
But what if they don't?
Well, when rulers abandon that mandate, when they become lawless oppressors, when they systematically violate the natural rights of the people and destroy justice, they fundamentally cease to be the legitimate authority that Paul is describing in that text.
Oh, so it's almost like a breach of contract. If the ruler becomes a terror to good conduct, they have essentially abdicated their God-given role.
Yes. And at that point, Reformed resistance theory argues that resistance isn't just a political option. It becomes a moral obligation. But it's crucial to understand how they frame this. They didn't see it as an aggressive anarchic revolt to just, burn everything down to the ground.
Right, it wasn't a riot.
No, they framed it as justified corporate self-defense. They were defending the existing order, the existing laws, and their God-given rights against a government that is essentially turned into a criminal enterprise.
That is fascinating. It's a highly ordered theological view of resistance, not just some mob mentality.
Right.
So what does this all mean for us when you look at Witherspoon's overall message, keeping the gospel first, trusting God's providence, and holding a high standard for justice? It feels incredibly relevant for our daily discipleship today.
It really does. It serves as a profound historical warning against certain forms of modern Christian nationalism, where the destiny of a nation and biblical covenant language get, well, improperly blended together.
We see that a lot.
We do.
Hmm.
And Witherspoon shows us that you can love your country, you can serve in its government, you can even fight for its liberty, but you must keep the cross of Christ at the absolute center. The nation, no matter how great, is temporary. The soul is eternal. If we ever lose sight of that priority, our political engagement just degrades into idolatry.
That is a truth every generation needs to wrestle with. Okay, so Witherspoon is laying this grand intellectual, theological groundwork for political liberty from Britain. But if you zoom in and look closer at what was actually happening in places like Massachusetts at that exact moment,
Oh boy, yeah.
I mean, the whole thing almost feels like a massive glaring contradiction because while the patriots in Boston were demanding freedom from Parliament, they were legally, systematically persecuting dissenting Christians in their own towns.
The hypocrisy of the situation was just staggering. It's honestly one of the great blind spots of the Revolutionary era. You had major colonies, specifically Massachusetts and Virginia, maintaining official state-established churches.
And what does that mean practically?
Well, in Massachusetts, it was the Congregationalist Church, the descendants of the Puritans. In Virginia, it was the Anglican Church. And if you were a dissenting Christian, say, a Baptist, you were forced by law to pay civil taxes to support the local Congregationalist or Anglican minister.
Even if you completely disagreed with them.
Oh, yeah. Whether you agreed with his theology or not, you were paying his salary.
And that brings us to our second historical figure, Isaac Backus, and the Baptist campaign for disestablishment. Backus is an incredible figure. He lived from 1724 to 1806. He was a New England Baptist pastor, and he emerges as the leading evangelical advocate for the complete separation of church and state in colonial New England.
And the primary document we are looking at here is his masterwork, written in 1773, titled An Appeal to the Public for Religious Liberty. He wrote this directly to the Massachusetts legislature, essentially demanding an end to tax-supported religion.
And what I love about Backus is that he doesn't start with political philosophy. He starts with scripture. He grounds his entire argument in an exegetical anchor from the Apostle Paul, specifically Galatians 5:15. Brethren, ye have been called unto liberty. Only use not liberty for an occasion to the flesh, but by love serve one another.
It's a great text.
Right. But how does he take that verse and build a case against a state-funded church?
He begins by pointing back to Jesus' own words to Pontius Pilate, "My kingdom is not of this world." Backus argues that because Christ's kingdom is fundamentally spiritual in nature, it cannot possibly be expanded, maintained, or enforced through federal coercion, civil taxation, or the magistrate's sword.
That makes sense.
He is championing a deep theological doctrine that Baptists historically call soul competency.
Okay, slow down and explain soul competency for us, because that term isn't used much outside of seminary classrooms today, but it is a massive concept.
It is. Soul competency is the biblical idea that every single individual possesses a direct, unmediated responsibility before God. Backus points to Romans 14:12, which says, "So then every one of us shall give account of himself to God."
So it's about personal accountability.
Yes, his logic is airtight. Because no civil magistrate, no governor, no tax collector can stand in your place and answer for you at the last judgment. No civil magistrate has the right or the jurisdiction to dictate or interpose in your matters of faith today. Religion is a matter purely between the Creator and the individual creature.
But wait, let me push back on this on behalf of the Puritans for a second.
Sure, go for it.
Didn't the Puritans who founded Massachusetts believe they were doing exactly what the Bible commanded? Like when John Winthrop talked about a city on a hill, didn't they think they were just copying Old Testament Israel by having a state church, a Christian commonwealth where the law of God was the law of the land?
They absolutely did. And that is precisely the theological nerve that Backus attacks. And this is a crucial moment for our goal of understanding the Bible more profoundly today. Backus breaks down the profound difference between the Old Covenant and the New Covenant.
Okay, how so?
He argues that the Puritans made a massive, catastrophic hermeneutical error. They took the national, civil, religious laws of Old Testament Israel and tried to basically copy-paste them onto 18th century Massachusetts.
Right, because Israel was a physical, geographic nation with a birthright covenant. If you were born in Israel, you were part of the covenant community.
Exactly. But Backus points out that under the new covenant, established by the blood of Christ, the church is an entirely voluntary body. It is an assembly gathered out of the world through spiritual rebirth, through regeneration, not through geographic boundaries or physical birth rates.
So you can't just mandate it by zip code.
Exactly. Backus argues that when you confound Old Testament national Israel with the New Testament spiritual church, you deeply distort both of them.
It completely changes the nature of what the church is supposed to be. And this really brings up the two kingdoms framework. Backus relies heavily on a famous metaphor developed by Roger Williams back in the 1600s. Williams described a wall of separation between the garden of the church and the wilderness of the world.
It is one of the most important metaphors in American history, though people often completely misunderstand it today. What was the original purpose of that wall?
Right, the wall is there to protect the garden. It's not to protect the state from the church, it's to protect the church from the state.
Yes.
Williams and Backus argued that whenever civil authority tries to break down that wall to, help the church with state power or state money, the church never ends up conquering the world. Instead, the world overgrows the garden. The church is invariably corrupted into a wilderness. It's a principle of contamination.
And we have to give the listener a real-world, visceral example of what this contamination looked like in the 1770s. Because it wasn't just a theoretical theological debate, it involved genuine suffering. Backus rigorously documented outrages like the Ashfield land seizures.
Oh, this story. This story made my blood absolutely boil when I was reading through the research. Paint the picture of what happened in Ashfield.
Okay, so picture a small, rural farming community in Massachusetts called Ashfield. You have a group of Baptists living there, working their farms, quietly practicing their faith. But the local Congregationalist church, the state-approved church, decides they need to build a new meeting house and settle a new minister.
Okay.
Under Massachusetts law, every single property owner in town was taxed to pay for this, regardless of their own religious affiliation.
Which means the Baptists are being handed a massive tax bill to fund a church they believe is preaching incorrect theology, and a church they never even attend.
Right. And naturally, as a matter of conscience, the Baptists refused to pay it. So what does the state do? The civil authorities, acting on behalf of the Congregationalist Church, sent armed constables to the Baptist farms.
It's just wild.
They literally seized the Baptist land, their orchards, their cattle, and get this, even the graves of their family members.
Yeah, it is sickening.
They took this property and auctioned it off at rock-bottom prices to their neighbors just to raise the funds to pay the Congregationalist minister's salary.
It is just breathtaking. Backus called this robbery. He said, when you do this, you completely transform gospel support into legal theft. And his main concern was the witness of the church.
Exactly. The witness.
He basically said, you are completely discrediting the gospel in the eyes of the public. Who on earth is going to believe you are preaching a gospel of free grace when you are sending armed men to steal your neighbor's cow to fund your pulpit?
It is the ultimate contradiction of the gospel. And Backus, who is a brilliant strategist, masterfully weaponized the patriots' own political logic against them. He exposed what we can call the tax paradox.
Yes. This is my favorite part of his appeal. He basically looks at the Massachusetts legislature, the same guys who are organizing the Boston Tea Party, and he says, how can you guys stand in the streets and cry taxation without representation when the British Parliament puts a tax on your tea, but then you turn around and use the power of the state to tax Baptists to support ministers they never chose, never heard, and never agreed with?
It's brilliant.
It is a devastating, unanswerable argument.
It really exposed the hypocrisy. And the Massachusetts legislature knew it was a bad look. So they tried to offer a compromise. They said, okay, look, if you are a dissenting Baptist, you can apply for a certificate of exemption. You just have to go to the civil magistrate, register your name, prove you attend a Baptist church, and we will exempt you from the church tax.
Okay, now wait.
But Backus and the Baptist Committee rejected the compromise entirely.
See, to a modern ear, that sounds like a fairly decent administrative compromise. Just fill out the form and you don't have to pay. Why did he refuse to do that?
Because for Backus, this was a matter of deep theological principle, not just financial convenience. He refused to beg the government for what the government called toleration.
Ah, toleration.
Right, because toleration implies that the state possesses the inherent foundational right to rule over your conscience, and they are just graciously granting you a special indulgence or a favor by letting you worship differently. Backus said, absolutely not. True religious liberty is an inalienable right granted solely by the Creator.
The government doesn't own it.
Exactly. The government does not create religious freedom, and therefore it cannot tolerate it. The government is merely obligated to protect the right that God has already given.
By filling out the certificate, he would have been acknowledging that the state had jurisdiction over his soul in the first place.
Exactly. He refused to bend the knee to Caesar in matters that belonged only to Christ.
This connects so deeply to our focus on practical ministry and discipleship. Bacchus is sending a warning across the centuries to pastors and church leaders today. State patronage neuters the church.
It really does.
Forced worship, or worship incentivized by cultural or political power, only produces hypocrites. If you want a spiritually vibrant, historically enduring church, it has to rely on voluntary giving, authentic gospel persuasion, and the power of the Holy Spirit. If you trade the Spirit's power for the state sword, you eventually lose both.
It is a timeless truth. The purity of the church demands separation from coercive state power.
Okay, as powerful as Bacchus's arguments were regarding religious hypocrisy, we have to move to our third historical figure because we have to address a much darker, far more tragic paradox that was hanging over the entire revolutionary era.
Yeah, we really do.
Bacchus exposed the hypocrisy of religious taxation, but at the very heart of the American Revolution was a society fighting and bleeding for the concept of liberty, while heavily fundamentally reliant on the brutal system of chattel slavery.
It is the great moral contradiction of the founding era. It is the original sin of the American project. And to explore how believers navigated this, we look to an incredible prophetic voice from the period, Lemuel Haynes.
I am so excited to talk about Lemuel Haynes because his story is just cinematic. Let me give you a sense of his background. Haynes lived from 1753 to 1833. He was born in Connecticut to a Caucasian mother and a father of African descent.
Right.
He was abandoned, and he spent his childhood as an indentured servant. But as a young man, he joins the Patriot cause. He becomes a Minuteman. He serves in the Continental Army. He marches to Fort Ticonderoga. And after the war, he goes on to become the first black minister officially ordained in a mainstream American Protestant denomination.
His life story is remarkable. He was a brilliant theologian and a passionate patriot. And in late 1776, right after Thomas Jefferson's Declaration of Independence is published and begins circulating, a 23-year-old Lemuel Haynes sits down and writes an essay.
What was it called?
It was an unpublished manuscript titled Liberty Further Extended, or Free Thoughts on the Illegality of Slavekeeping.
It is a phenomenal, breathtaking piece of writing because what he does is he takes Jefferson's famous words, the words that define the American cause, and he treats them as a profound theological premise.
Right. He doesn't just read it as politics.
No. He quotes the Declaration, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal." But he doesn't just treat it as a neat political slogan. He takes it seriously, and he grounds it fiercely in the biblical creation mandate.
The exegetical work Haynes does in this document is brilliant. He anchors his argument in Acts 17.26, which says, God hath made of one blood all nations of men for to dwell on all the face of the earth.
Of one blood.
Yes. Haynes uses this to prove that skin color, geographic origin, or social status are entirely irrelevant to the imago Dei, the image of God. Every single human being bears the image of the Creator equally. Therefore, to deprive a human being of their liberty, assuming they haven't committed a crime, is not just a political wrong. It is a direct assault on God's design and creation.
And he didn't pull any punches either. He wasn't gentle about it. He invoked the strict biblical prohibitions against man-stealing found in Exodus 21.1c and 1 Timothy 1.10.
So we went right to the text.
He essentially argued that because the entire origin of the African slave trade and American chattel slavery was rooted in kidnapping and man-stealing, the entire institution was inherently illegal, historically illegitimate, and morally corrupt from the ground up.
He turned the revolutionary rhetoric inward on the colonists, just like Isaac Backus did regarding taxes. But Haynes did it regarding physical bodily liberty.
Right. When I was thinking about how Haynes framed his argument to his fellow Patriot soldiers, it feels like he's pointing out a massive issue of scale. It's almost like, imagine someone complaining about a paper cut while ignoring a severed limb.
Yeah, wow.
Haynes is basically saying to his white fellow patriots, look at what we are doing. We are willing to fight a bloody, grueling war against the greatest military empire on earth over a modest stamp tax or a duty on tea.
The paper cut.
The paper cut. But you are completely ignoring lifelong hereditary chattel servitude, which is like a severed limb. If liberty is an inherent God-given right, it has to apply to everyone. If you can justify denying it to black people based on their race, then liberty isn't a fundamental human right at all. It's just a privilege for the powerful.
And that completely undermines their cause.
Exactly. If that's true, your entire philosophical argument against King George collapses into total incoherence.
That captures the sheer force of his logic perfectly. He exposed the incoherence of the patriot cause while simultaneously defending the ideals of the patriot cause. But if we connect this to the bigger picture, Haynes goes even deeper than political logic. He grounds his anti-slavery argument in deep Reformed theology. Haynes utilizes what historians call Edwardson Calvinism to utterly dismantle the myth of racial hierarchy.
Okay, pause right there. Edwardson Calvinism. Explain that to me like I'm 5 years old. I know it refers to Jonathan Edwards, the great revivalist of the Great Awakening. But how does a complex theological system like Calvinism become a weapon to dismantle racism?
It is actually a very profound connection. It comes down to the core doctrines of depravity and grace. Haynes, following the theology of Jonathan Edwards, argued that all human beings, regardless of ancestry, are equally fallen in Adam.
We're all in the same boat.
We all share the exact same ruined spiritual condition. And simultaneously, we all equally need the redeeming sovereign grace of Jesus Christ. Therefore, any argument asserting that one race is inherently morally, spiritually, or intellectually superior to another is not just scientifically wrong, it is an expression of deep sinful pride.
It's theological heresy.
Exactly. It denies the universal leveling effects of the fall, and it denies God's common grace to all humanity. Calvinism, in Haynes's hands, meant that all men are truly equal at the foot of the cross.
That is incredibly powerful. The theology of human depravity actually becomes the basis for human equality. We are all equally broken, so no one has the right to enslave another. Haynes even took this a step further and warned of providential chastisement.
Yes. Drawing on the old Puritan tradition of reading God's providence in current events, Haynes looked at the early, disastrous military setbacks the Continental Army was facing. Washington's army was struggling. And Haynes suggested that these defeats might actually be God's righteous, sovereign judgment on America for the national sin of slavery.
Wow, he preached that.
He did. He essentially preached, if you want God's favor in your war for liberty against Britain, you'd better execute justice and grant liberty at home.
This requires us to practice what we might call critical charity when we look back at the founding era. We can, and we absolutely should, celebrate the ideals of the revolution. The ideals of liberty and God-given rights changed the world. But we must also honestly, soberly acknowledge the profound moral failure and the tragic blindness of so many of the founders regarding slavery. Haynes saw with crystal clarity what Thomas Jefferson and George Washington refused to see.
And Haynes didn't just write this theology, he lived it. This is what truly inspires a love for Christ when you study his life. After the war, he didn't just become a political activist, he became a minister. And in 1788, he was called to pastor a Congregationalist church in Rutland, Vermont.
A church that was almost entirely white.
Exactly. And he pastored that congregation faithfully for over 30 years. He was known internationally for his defense of Orthodox theology.
He proved with his entire life that true reconciliation and true lasting unity isn't found in secular identity politics or in endless cycles of grievance. It is found in recognizing the shared imago Dei in one another, and ultimately it is found at the foot of the cross. The gospel of Jesus Christ actually unites believers across all racial and cultural lines under one head.
It is a stunning, beautiful legacy. Haynes brilliantly argued that God-given rights precede human governments and apply to absolutely everyone by virtue of creation, but that creates a massive practical problem for the founders. Once the war is won, how do you actually write that theological concept into a legal framework?
Right, how do you enforce it?
Exactly. How do you prevent the new government from just ignoring it?
And that exact crisis erupted just a few years later. Which brings us to our fourth and final historical figure. So Haynes proves the theology of liberty. But we have to transition to James Madison to see the blueprint for how it actually became law.
Madison is so important here.
The setting is 1785, the war is over, and we are in the state of Virginia. Patrick Henry, the famous give me liberty or give me death orator, he is trying to pass a bill in the Virginia legislature. The bill would levy a general tax on citizens to fund teachers of the Christian religion. Patrick Henry genuinely believed that the state needed to financially support the church in order to keep society moral and stable.
Henry's argument was very common. He thought without state funding, religion will collapse, and without religion, the republic will collapse.
Makes logical sense to them at the time.
Sure. But James Madison, who's a young, brilliant legislator heavily influenced by his time under John Witherspoon at Princeton, steps up to defeat this bill. Madison pens a document, initially published anonymously, called the Memorial and Remonstrance Against Religious Assessments.
Quite a title.
It is widely considered by historians to be the most significant, eloquent American political document on religious liberty ever written.
It is a 15-point petition, and it is a masterclass in argument. But point one, here's where it gets really interesting. Point one is what really blew my mind. Because Madison, who is often thought of as this Enlightenment political architect, grounds his political argument in profound conservative theology. He argues for a concept called antecedent obligation.
This is the linchpin of his entire argument. Madison says that a person's duty to the Creator is antecedent, meaning it comes prior to or before any social contract.
Before government even exists.
Exactly. Before you are a citizen of Virginia, before you are a subject of the United States government, you are a created being subject to your Creator. Your obligation to worship God according to your conscience exists before the government even exists.
So, logically, the government simply has no jurisdiction to interfere with your prior covenantal obligation to God. You can't give the government authority over something that belongs exclusively to God. Conscience operates by spiritual conviction, not by physical force.
Exactly. Madison wrote, "What is here a right towards men is a duty towards the Creator. What we claim as an inalienable right to our fellow citizens is actually a binding duty we owe to God."
That is profound.
And Madison argues that if we give the government even 1 inch of authority over this sacred space, we lose everything. This leads to his famous principle of obsta principiis, which translates to prudence at the threshold.
The slippery slope argument?
Yes, but a highly intellectual version of it.
It makes me think of spotting a tiny drop of water leaking through the concrete of a massive dam. If you see that leak, you don't say, oh, it's just a drop. We'll wait and see.
Right, because then the dam breaks.
You don't wait for the flood to wash away the town. You stop it right there at the threshold. Madison is essentially saying to the people of Virginia, if you let the legislature tax you 3 pence to support Christianity in general today, the exact same legal authority can establish a single specific sect tomorrow.
And then they can ban your dissenting worship entirely the day after that.
The moment you concede the principle, you've lost the war.
He was incredibly prescient. And he wasn't just speaking theoretically. In points 6, 7, and 8 of the memorial, Madison turns to church history to prove that state funding actually harms the church. He points out that Christianity flourished best and was most pure in its first 3 centuries.
Before Constantine.
Exactly, before Constantine, before the Edict of Milan, when it had 0 state support and was often actively persecuted.
But the moment the Roman state got involved and started funding the church, Madison says it bred pride and indolence in the clergy, ignorance and servility in the laity. State patronage turns pastors into lazy state functionaries instead of humble, fiery servants of the gospel.
And politically, the reason this document succeeded in defeating Patrick Henry's bill is because of a fascinating, deeply pragmatic alliance. You had Enlightenment rationalists like Madison and Thomas Jefferson who wanted government neutrality and freedom of thought.
But they couldn't win alone.
No, they didn't have enough votes on their own. They teamed up with the evangelical dissenters, the Baptists and Presbyterians across Virginia, folks who thought exactly like Isaac Backus. The evangelicals wanted the freedom to preach the gospel without state interference.
So they came at the issue from entirely different philosophical angles, but they arrived at the exact same political conclusion. Keep the coercive power of the state out of the garden of the church. This memorial and remonstrance was so successful that it directly laid the philosophical foundation for the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution just a few years later.
And connecting this back to our focus on practical ministry today, Madison and the evangelical dissenters recognized a truth that we desperately need to remember. The gospel of Jesus Christ simply does not need the government's money, its endorsement, or its coercive legal power to thrive.
It really doesn't.
The gospel is the power of God unto salvation. In fact, attempting to promote the gospel through legal compulsion completely undermines its credibility to a watching world. It signals to unbelievers that Christianity can't stand on its own internal truth and spiritual power.
Wow. We have covered a massive amount of historical and theological ground today. Let's try to synthesize this journey for everyone listening. We started in the pulpit of Princeton with John Witherspoon's grand, majestic vision of God's providence.
Seeing how God sovereignly orchestrates even the darkest political passions of men to achieve his purposes, while reminding us that our greatest enemy is our own sin, not the government.
Then we looked at Isaac Backus, who bravely exposed the hypocrisy of his own patriot leaders. He defended the uncoerced conscience and the purity of the church, demanding that the state stay out of the affairs of the soul.
Then we explored the brilliant prophetic mind of Lemuel Haynes, a black patriot who took the soaring rhetoric of the Declaration and anchored it in the creation order, utilizing Reformed theology to dismantle racism and demand true equality under God.
And finally, we saw how James Madison took these deep theological truths about the antecedent rights of the soul and codified them into a constitutional blueprint that protects religious liberty for everyone.
So, tying all these historical threads together, we've seen how vital it is to understand the Bible deeply, recognizing the distinct spiritual nature of the New Testament church compared to the physical nation of Old Testament Israel.
We've seen how trusting God's sovereign orchestration of history can anchor our personal faith when the political world around us feels like it's spinning out of control.
And we've seen how the gospel compels us to view every single person as an image bearer of God. But above all, this history should inspire a profound, overwhelming love for Christ. Because when you look at all of this, the Revolutionary Wars, the drafting of constitutions, the intense political maneuvering, the tragic moral failures, you realize one ultimate truth. Earthly empires will always rise and fall.
Always.
Human revolutions, even the greatest and most noble of them, are deeply flawed. Human governments will always struggle to maintain justice.
But Christ's kingdom is not of this world. It is an eternal kingdom of grace. It is voluntarily received. It is never forced by a magistrate's sword. It is ruled by a perfect, faithful Savior who truly, eternally sets the captives free.
That is the ultimate takeaway. Our supreme allegiance is always to a king whose throne is forever.
Which leaves us with a final, somewhat provocative thought for you to mull over as you go about your week. We've seen today how the early evangelicals, the Baptists, the Presbyterians fought, bled, and debated so incredibly hard to free the church from state control and state funding just so the gospel could remain pure and uncompromised. So, in what ways are modern Christians tempted to hand that hard-won spiritual independence right back to the state in exchange for just a little bit of cultural or political power?
It is a challenging question, and it's one every single generation of the church has to answer for themselves.
Keep diving deep, keep looking to Christ, and we'll see you next time.